the primary Union efforts focused on Georgia and Virginia, Confederate forces in North Carolina went on the offensive, trying to recover some of the territory lost to Burnside's expedition. That effort was led by Major General George Pickett, who had been put in charge of the Confederate Department of Southern Virginia and North Carolina a few months after his famous charge at Gettysburg. Pickett's primary target was New Bern, a vital seaport and transportation center that had been occupied by federal forces since March 1862. Robert E. Lee informed Confederate President Jefferson Davis on January 2nd that any attempt to recapture New Bern should be made soon. Lee wrote, "I can spare troops for the purpose, which will not be the case as spring approaches." A multi-pronged attack plan was developed for Pickett by North Carolina General Robert Hoke.
Prong 1, Hoke would attack New Bern from the west, coming in on the Neuse Road. Prong 2 would come in from the north of the Neuse River, take Fort Anderson, turn the guns at Fort Anderson on New Bern. Prong 3 would be soldiers coming in from the south of the Trent River, crossing the Trent River, and attacking New Bern from the south. The fourth prong would be a group of Navy men, and I hate to use the word Navy men because a lot of them were riffraff and just anybody who had any information or any experience on the water. But they would come down from Kinston on the Neuse River and capture the federal gunboats and take the guns on the federal gunboats and turn those guns on the forts in New Bern and attack that way. All four prongs would attack New Bern at the same time, meaning that New Bern is being attacked from all four directions.
Hoke led one prong of the attack from the west with between 5,000 and 6,000 men. They advanced along the Neuse Road toward Batchelder's Creek, running into Union defenders there on February 1st.
There are rumors in the federal camp that there are Confederates in the area, but Colonel Peter Classen, who is in charge, passes that off as only rumors. He has the defenses set up for the camp, which is an outpost of the Federals 10 miles west of New Bern. The bridge crossing Batchelder's Creek, the boards on across the bridge have been taken up, and the only thing left are the skeleton that is holding the bridge up. He has men there to guard that bridge so that nobody can cross it.
The defenders would eventually be driven off by infantry and artillery fire brought upon them by the larger Confederate force. Hoke pursued the Federals toward Fort Totten, stopping about a mile from the fort. Fort Totten was the largest fortification manned by the Federals around New Bern. It covered 6 to 8 acres and was built by formerly enslaved people after the town was occupied in 1862.
And each side of the fort had 5 guns or 5 cannon on top of the fort to protect the town. At the end, on the outside of the fort, was a 3-foot ditch surrounding the fort. Inside the fort, there was barracks built as well as tents to house the men inside the fort. In 1862, there were about between 400 and 500 men manning the fort. In 1864, at the time of the third attack on New Bern, there were only 200 to 250 men.
As Hoke moved on New Bern from the west, Colonel James Deering was working on his part of the plan, which was to capture Fort Anderson and turn its guns on the town.
Deering attacks Fort Anderson with about 3,000 men. Colonel Anderson is defending Fort Anderson with about 250 to 300 men.
Despite significantly outnumbering the defenders, Deering decided Fort Anderson was too strong to attack. He withdrew to Kinston the next day. Meanwhile, moving on New Bern from the south was General Seth Barton, who had advanced from Kinston with about 5,000 men.
Barton left Kinston on January the 30th and headed towards New Bern. He crossed the Trent River and came towards New Bern south of the Trent River, arriving at this point, just south of New Bern, on February the 1st. Across the river from here, he could see New Bern, could see actually people in the backyards of their houses, could see cherry blossoms and apple blossoms blooming in the trees. In New Bern, there were about 5,000 federal troops. He looked over and examined the town of New Bern and decided that there was no way he could capture New Bern. Now, on the west side of New Bern, General Hope was waiting for Seth Barton to attack, and he was listening for the guns of the attack so he would know to attack from the west. Seth Barton decided he could not attack New Bern and capture it.
The naval component of the Confederate attack was led by a contingent of some 250 men in a dozen small boats under John Taylor Wood. They were to capture or destroy Federal gunboats protecting the town.
As they got outside of Kinston, the fog was so thick they couldn't see their hands in front of their faces, so they turned back and went back to Kinston. The next night, February the 1st, they headed back to New Bern. This time the fog was still thick, but they headed on down to the river towards New Bern. When they got to New Bern, they found one Federal gunboat, and that was the USS Underwriter.
The assault force boarded the Underwriter, and vicious hand-to-hand fighting ensued.
In the fierce fighting, the captain of the Underwriter was killed, and a number of others were killed. At the same time, a number of crew members of the Underwriter jumped overboard and swam to shore, landing at this point here.
Realizing the ship had been captured by Confederates, Union shore batteries fired upon the vessel. Woods's assault force set fire to the Underwriter and abandoned it. The ship exploded and sank early on February 2nd. In support of the attack on New Bern, Brigadier General James G. Martin was ordered to attack the Federal garrison at Newport Barracks about 25 miles south of New Bern. He left Wilmington with about 2,000 men.
Halfway between New Bern and Morehead City on the Newport River was a set of Federal barracks. The purpose of the Federals there was to control the railroad between New Bern and Morehead, as well as control the telegraph lines between New Bern and Morehead. It was very important that the Confederates capture this particular post because they did not want the Federals in New Bern to be contacting the Federals in Morehead, because if they did, the Federals in Morehead would come to the aid of the Federals in New Bern during the battle. So Confederates then came in from Swansboro, came into Newport, and a big fight began between the Federals and the Confederates at Newport.
While the 900-man Union garrison would eventually be driven off, the Confederates would fail in their attempt to retake New Bern. 3 men from the 9th Vermont were awarded Medals of Honor for their actions at Newport Barracks.
The attack on New Bern totally fails for a number of reasons. One, General Barton did not do his part in attacking New Bern because he felt like he did not have the forces available to attack New Bern from the south of the Trent River. So he turned around and hightailed it back to Kinston. Deering, here General Deering felt that he could not attack or did not or failed to attack completely and take over Fort Anderson. He had an outstanding number of men. He could have taken over Fort Anderson, but he chose not to do so. He figured, he asked them to surrender. They would not do so, but he could have captured Fort Anderson by just attacking, going in and charging and taking over the fort. He failed to do so, so he backed off and went back to Kinston. The naval assault of New Bern down the Neuse River was a failure. They only captured one gunboat and it sank. The other gunboats were totally not around, and so they were not captured. The only successful attack was done by Hope. He captured Batchelder's Creek. He got to within a mile of the fort, Fort Totten. He was sitting there waiting for the others to take place. The other attacks failed, So he was left totally alone, and he had no choice but to retreat. So the third battle of New Bern was a total failure.
Although they failed to recapture New Bern, the Confederates scored victories in the destruction of the Underwriter and the Union base at Newport Barracks. Pickett soon would be recalled to Virginia, and Hoke would again take command. Hoke would lead another attempt to recapture New Bern in May, but that would be called off by the Confederate High Command. The port city would remain in federal control for the rest of the war.